I'm repeating a phrase I've used before. I think that the great confrontation to come will be to the Cold War what the Second World War was to the First World War, which means that it's possible, even if I think it's difficult not to have hot episodes since we have to have a minimal war of movement, that the war will be completely cold. Then of course I see we're asking you to clarify something. Yes. So we're saying there's going to be an increase in the number of proxies or the destabilization of a country within the enemy's sphere of influence. So don't worry, I'll give you all the details of all the movements I think are going to happen. I'll tell you the war that's going to happen. That's what this show is all about. So I know the preamble is Comac, but let's get on with it. You'll see. So I'll just end on this note. You could say to me, and you'd be right to say to me, basically you're not bothering much, you're not getting your feet wet, you're telling us there's going to be a war, but maybe it'll be a cold war. So you're going to tell me you don't give a damn about us. I understand. It's a question to be justified, but I fundamentally disagree, and I want to say why. Because in spite of everything, and once again, the important thing is to distinguish clearly, and there's no point in drowning the fish here. Let me explain why. It's important to distinguish between necessary history and contingent history. Once again, what I can predict with certainty, at least from my point of view, I'm certain of, and when I tell you this, it's because I truly believe in it, and I'd be surprised if things didn't turn out as I say, is what corresponds to necessary history, where I'm not sure is contingent history. And therefore, for the contingent story, in spite of everything, I'm trying to sketch it out, to say what seems most likely to me, but I can't be 100% positive about it. But let's take a step back. Let's imagine, I come to see you on the basis of my work here, and eventually that's all I would have been capable of, all I would have been able to be affirmative about on the basis of my work. That's it. I would have said to you, look, the USSR has been in a phase, what we call a trajectory of revanchist imperialism since 64-5. So at the end of 45 years there must be a war, a new war against the United States, which will be a war of opposition that will tire the USSR and bring it down. The USSR will break up in 15 years' time, around 95-90. And in the following 15 years you'll see the emergence of a figure who will be a vengeful imperialist in Russia, who will want to reunite the Russian world and so on. There will be a return of aggression after a period of calm. Look at the USSR, it's Brezhnev's USSR, triumphant, and at the time you had a lot of books explaining that the Russians would win in the end, that the Russian model would triumph. I remember coming across a book like that from 1976, I think, at university on a shelf, and I was very amused because the guy explained that the USSR was likely to win in the end, and in particular because 1997 is the peak of the USSR. It's the time when their nuclear arsenal surpassed that of the United States. It's the time of the Helsinki agreements. It's all that. It's before the arrival of Reagan. It's with the American difficulties in Iran, etc. So it's really the low point for the United States. But I could have told you that and people would have thought I was crazy, and what I would have said was, wait a minute, there's going to be a war. But in the nuclear age there can't be a war, and I would have told you no, there might be a Cold War, and in this case, with a war of position, it was a good fit. So what happened? There was the return, what you might call the return of the Cold War, the return of tension between Reagan's America and the USSR. There was the USSR's invasion of Afghanistan, which was a tough military test. There were Reagan's embargoes, there was the Able Archer exercise, which scared the Russians to death. There was a rise in tensions like that. There was the Chernobyl disaster, and there was the breakup of the USSR. So I couldn't have foreseen at the time whether there would be a hot war like the 14th War, which would be opposed but very deadly in Germany, for example, if the Russians had actually tried to invade Western Europe. I couldn't have said all that, but what I could have said, and I would have been right to say it, was to say that in 15 years' time the USSR will have collapsed, and 15 years after that you'll have a Putin. Well, that's the kind of thing I'm going to say tonight. I can't tell you whether it's hot or cold, but I can tell you what I think it will be if it's hot and if it's cold, and in any case this is what the outcome of this strategic confrontation will be, and this is what the world will look like strategically after this confrontation, i.e. on the horizon of the XXX-X7 war. That's what I'm going to tell you this evening. The intro was a little long, but I hope you haven't lost the thread, because now we're going to see what this next world war is going to be like, because in any case it will deserve the name, just as the Cold War deserved the name of World War III. It's the morphology of this Fourth World War that we're now considering. Is there a quick question on that before we go on? I hope I've made my presentation clear. I know that imagining nuclear weapons, so I'm looking at... Yeah, no, you can go ahead. Alright, I don't make too much noise when I inhale. Is that okay? No, perfect, good. Well then. Well, now we're gonna see, we've done a little bit of everything. The strategic situation of Europe, we've done that of the United States, we've done that of China, we've done that of Russia, we've done all the big players, Turkey. So now we're ready to see what happens next. So I told you last time when we did the program on China that in my opinion it would start, and this is what I said in my book La classe des guerres à venir, that it would start around India. Why? Because I say that India will be what I call the China of China, since I draw a parallel between China and Japan. Japan invaded China in 237, it had started to invade China in 1931, it had invaded Manchuria, but the real start of the war, the one that wouldn't end until the end of the Second World War, was the invasion of 1937. Japan invading China, and today the China of today's China, which is Japan, is India. That's the new China. Today, the rising power, and I refer you to the last program, the rising power is China, and the space it wants to expand into, and above all where it doesn't want to have enemies on its back, is India. I'm not going to go into the details of the strategic situation around the Himalayas, the confrontation, the attack, and so on. We'll just repost our little map of Kashmir. There you have it. The I-China axis, I remind you, is what belongs to what has been occupied since the 162 war by Chinese troops. Kashmir Jammu is the part that belongs to and is occupied by the Indians, and the green part, Gilgit-Baltistan, is occupied by Pakistan. Today, since last April, there has been a confrontation, a military face-off on the border between the I-China axis and Ladakh, which we call the line of actual control, because it's not a border determined by treaty, it's the line on which the troops stopped in 1962, quite simply. So there's been tension there for some months now. And let me remind you, you've got the Sino-Pakistan corridor which passes through Gilgit-Baltistan. India wants to threaten to hold a knife to China's throat, or kidneys if you like, to tell it to be careful, don't hurt me too much because I can cut off your corridor which gives you access to Middle Eastern oil. And so if you're in a confrontation with the United States, you'll be hurt because of me. So China is trying to secure this before, on the other hand, trying to retake Taiwan, because China knows that if it tries to retake Taiwan, as I explained to you last time, it will find itself in confrontation with a number of neighbors, in particular the United States, and that it won't be able to wage this kind of conflict if it simply can't secure its supply of hydrocarbons. So that's why I think that's where it's going to start, i.e. On the next map, that today you have China deploying planes, drones, probably troops in fact in Pakistan already, and so China with Pakistan's help will be able to invade Indian territory. And I refer back to what I said at the beginning. The idea is to attack a place that is not in nevralgia, for which the adversary will not be ready to launch nuclear missiles, and to take it over relatively quickly. So for now, forget the arrows that go to the northeast space and would invade the south. Just see the arrows that would attack occupied Pakistan, Indian occupied Kashmir in fact. Presumably that's where it would start, leading to a state of war between India and China, because China might feel that the math allows it to take this on without going to nuclear war. In any case, China knows that its nuclear potential is greater than that of India. A few years ago, I think it was in 2016, the newspapers were a little agitated because the Chinese had deployed nuclear missiles on the Russian border, i.e. in the north of China, in Manchuria, on the Russian border. They had deployed and tested nuclear missiles, and the commentators rather foolishly said, does this mean there are tensions between Putin and China? Is China trying to intimidate Russia? Not at all, because there's no point in bringing nuclear missiles to someone's border to intimidate them. There's really no point, because a nuclear missile can't be fired from 5 kilometers away. On the other hand, the deployment of these nuclear missiles was a sign sent to India. Why was this? It seems odd, because it seems counterintuitive, because it's at the other end. But it wasn't. because China was showing that it could deploy nuclear missiles on a part of its territory that was beyond the reach of India's nuclear missiles. So China was saying, I've got a second strike capability on you in the event of a nuclear war, and so the Indians know very well that they are not in a position of nuclear strength because all Indian territory is within range of Chinese missiles, whereas all Chinese territory is not within range of Indian missiles, and the Chinese have nuclear missiles deployed in areas that are out of range of Indian missiles. So that's the first element of intimidation, and then there's the whole strategic situation I explained last time, which means that if the Indians were attacked from all sides at this point, they would probably find it very difficult to hold on. Even though we're still in winter at the moment, so it's still early days, it's not impossible that as soon as spring arrives, we'll start to see things stirring up on that side. So I think it's here, we're asking you if Pakistan isn't linked to the United States. Not at all. Well, historically, yes, and during the Cold War in particular, but things have become much more tense over the last few years, and then there was, I remind you, Bin Laden, who was hidden over there and all that, and in any case, Pakistan is now completely in China's hands. China has been investing there for 20 years, putting money in, building things, even deploying troops, so now it's all over. I mean, no one questions who Pakistan is allied with anymore. In fact, Pakistan is practically a vassal of China, so that's another way of putting it. So today, clearly and in particular against India, because the number one enemy is ideological. You can't get much more enemy than that. It's hard to be more hostile than Pakistan and India, so if China is hostile to India, it's all to Pakistan's advantage. And what's more, as I mentioned last week, the difference in power between China, India and Pakistan means that Pakistan is now obliged to have a powerful protector against India, because it's clear to them that they can no longer hold their own economically. It's important. So, why is it important? I think that's where it's going to start. Because the Second World War actually started there. It began in the equivalent. In other words, World War II began in 237 when Japan invaded China. This was the first theater, and it was to be a very important one throughout the war. And why is it important? Because at the same time, this war, which appears to be a secondary theater, really begins to sow the seeds of conflict between the United States and Japan. That's why the United States won't put an oil embargo on Japan. That's what's going to create the tensions that will eventually lead to Pearl Harbor. That's what's going to bring Japan over to Germany's side. So that's where it really begins. But there's also another point that's important. It's that often when people think about where the Third War is going to start, so they say the Third or Fourth World War, where could a world war start? So often we say it's around Korea or it's in the China Sea because that's where the tensions are. And we often point to places where there are direct tensions between the major powers that could start a war. But that's not how it starts, because you don't have a war. Wars never start directly. If you take the Great War, it started because of Serbia, because of the assassination of the Archduke. But above all, it started with the strategic question of Serbia. In other words, you always have a small power, and then you have a game of alliances that will make it so. And above all, international order is inertia. So the big conflicts only start once you've started to shake things up a bit, and then you get some movement. You know, it's like if you've got modeling clay, you've got to shape it a bit before it gets hot, and you can do what you want with it. The international order is a bit like that. And so today, just about anywhere, you say that the United States is the world's policeman anyway, and nobody wants to go to war directly with the United States. So that closes the question. But in fact, an international order cracks, so you start to have a secondary conflict that's going to attract attention, and then you've got another place where you're going to have tensions, you're going to have a bigger one that's going to get agitated too. And little by little, each theater and the appearance of each theater makes the appearance of other theaters more likely, because the gendarme is busy, you see, and you know he won't be able to intervene everywhere at once. And last time, I told you that what prompted Japan to invade Southeast Asia was simply the fact that England, which was the British Empire at the time and the great thalassocratic power, was at loggerheads with Hitler. So this is how tensions arise and accumulate. So for me, the first movement is going to start there in China, and it's already going to cause a lot of worries for a lot of people. on the other side. So that's the first thing. Having said that, then the real aspect of the war, where it's going, the next stage we'll say, where it's really going to start to escalate directly. I think that just as it started in Europe with the German expansion into Poland, it will also be something like that around Russia, and that Putin will feel that it's his turn too, because in particular, perhaps as Russia is still quite close to India at the moment, he'll be able to negotiate support by saying, go ahead, I won't shout, I won't make a resolution against you at the UN, etc. To the Chinese, while you take Kashmir from the Indians, you're helping Pakistan to get Kashmir back, but you're supporting me in what I'm doing in Europe. That's a big possibility. And so, in my opinion, the next event that's going to set off a bit of a snowball is in Europe. So before getting into everything, let's go back to the case of the revanchist imperialists. I won't go through it all again, but I'll just show you these two things. Because these are all the major cases of revanchist imperialism I've been talking about. Go ahead and show me the two territorial losses. This is to remind you of the territorial losses in the first case in all the trajectories of revanchist imperialists I've identified. The first war, the one that caused the collapse and loss of territory. So you have the 7 Years' War, which caused France to lose most of its colonial space in India and North America. You have the First World War, which caused Germany to lose a large part of its territory in Europe and its colonial empire in Africa and a little in Asia. And you have the collapse of 1989, which saw the USSR lose part of its territory, since the USSR was more than just Russia, as well as all its vassals in the Warsaw Pact and its external vassals in what was known as the Soviet Empire, i.e. External communist countries. This is also what happened to Philip V's Macedonia after the Second Macedonian War. These were the territories that Carthage had lost at the end of the First Republic War, i.e. Sardinia, Corsica and Sicily. These are the humiliating losses of territory that lead to revolution, the equivalent of national revolution on the spot, and then imperialist revenge. So you can take that away from me and move on to the next map. Second point, I'd like to remind you that there's a shift towards the east, as we saw when we talked about Russia, Turkey and Erdogan. I think I've already shown you this map, which shows the eastward shift of the imperialist revengers, dividing the French Republic in two, Germany in two, and the Russian Federation in one. I explained the reason for this eastward shift when I did the program on Erdogan, so I won't go over it again. It's not interesting today. It's just this, I don't know if it was in 2015 or 2016 that I wrote an article on this, but you can show me the following map. Libyan intervention. I said at the time that there was still no trace of Russia in Libya. I said at the time when there was no sign of Russia in Libya yet, and you can't throw flowers at me, but by pure historionomic calculation, I said that there would be something there, that Russia was likely to intervene in Libya in the same way as it had in Syria. Why did I say that? Because I'd made this little projection, and I'd noticed that every time the imperialist Orban Tsar intervened, it was in this era, or at least in the modern era, i.e. in this geostrategic space that is Europe-Mediterranean. Napoleon had fought in the Egyptian campaign, but the Third Reich had to fight in Rommel's war. And so I was saying that, as you can see, there's a shift that's reversed. So while the Orban Tsar imperialists are moving eastwards, it seems that the battle is moving westwards, and that would fall in Libya. And so I was saying that there's likely to be a Russian intervention in Libya, and the fact is that since last year, so with this COVID, I don't know if it was since last year or the year before, in 2009, you've got the deployment of Russian troops, which is proven. You've got aircraft in particular, anti-aircraft batteries, etc. in Libya on the side of Marshal Haftar, while Turkey is deploying on the other side, on the side of the Tripoli government. But that's interesting. Another movement, so the war aspect in the Mediterranean is already here, it's happening, and you've already got clashes on one side, a bit proxy between General Haftar, Marshal Haftar supported by Russia, and on the other side the government supported by Erdogan. So that's after what I said last time, because I'd like to remind you that in my book Atlas des Guerres à Venir, the war between China and India is something I've been talking about for a long time. I think my first article on it was in 2016, at a time when nothing had happened yet. In 2077 there was the confrontation in Doklam. Now, for the past 6 months, there's been this confrontation over Ladakh, And what I was saying was that it would start, the morphology would start with a conflict between India and Pakistan, and then China would intervene to take Pakistan's side, and that's when the chain of events would begin, and the war between China and India would start. But what happened? In 2010, you had a major attack in Kashmir against a bus carrying Indian troops, and India retaliated by bombing a camp in Pakistan, a terrorist training camp, it says, in Pakistan. There was an air battle between Pakistan and India. This conflict has not been resolved since. They are still in tension, even if there has been a slight de-escalation. It has not gone into open conflict. But it is on this basis that Modi, the Indian president, the Indian prime minister, decided to change the status of Indian Kashmir in order to proceed with a formal annexation, I'd like to say a total takeover, and it's from there since the Ladakh movement. So if you like, once again, on the morphology of the evolution, we're in line with what I said. We may not yet be in very hot confrontations, but on the order of operations we're good. So there was that. That's the first forecast I made. That's the second, the third. Please show me the next card. Please, third thing I said. Precisely, we're asking you if France also supports Haftar. So, presumably there are some BIs over there. I think it's because we're thinking that it might be a case of amphibia, i.e. That it would turn off the immigration tap. Well, in my opinion, it's something like that. But we haven't sent a plane there, so in all likelihood, if it's in someone's hands, it's Putin's rather than ours. On the other hand, maybe that's why we've been very quiet about Putin deploying planes, because unlike Assad, it's rather convenient for us if Haftar wins. So yes, we do support him, but not the way Putin does. So that's the third thing I mentioned as part of the first steps. In this Atlas of Future Wars, in fact, at the end, there was an outline like this, with dates and places, saying more or less what would happen. So on about 10 pages, you have the whole morphology of war like that. I've often been told, and I think it was Thiermont who astutely put the question to me recently, that it was supposed to start in 2017. Yes, because the book came out in 2017, and so for the morphology, I'd start in that year. But I always made it clear that the idea was to give a morphology. In other words, thanks to a succession of dates and by pointing out places, you can say that in total, roughly speaking, over such and such a period of time, 3, 4, 5 years, I don't know exactly how many I was saying, all this will happen, and more or less in this order. That's the important information. It's not the exact date I gave, it's the morphology once again. And so, another element that I announced was Vladimir Putin's annexation of Belarus. So that was 2017. In 2018, Lukashenko began to complain about Putin's insistence on fully implementing what is known as the Belarusian State of Union, which is a kind of federation of the two that had broken down, that had been initiated in the 90s, that was supposed to lead to complete economic and institutional integration. It's a friend who never made it, and Putin has brought it back to life. So in fact, it's simply an attempt to annex Belarus. Lukashenko is full of it. There was the unrest during Lukashenko's re-election, which I told you about in the first mission, in which Putin played a very murky game, because it seems that Putin also stirred up the opposition, played both sides. In fact, he played the opposition to Lukashenko, but he also defended Lukashenko to reserve the possibility, in fact. And so, in fact, what's happening is that on the occasion of this, Putin has taken a rather skillful action, as he always does. Putin is very clever, so he said, "I'm putting a large police force in reserve on the Belarusian border in case there are riots and so on. We'll step in and help maintain law and order." But at the same time, it showed that he was intervening, that he was present, but that he was in the background, and it showed a reasonable attitude towards the international community, except that at the same time you had lots of trucks and armored vehicles entering with their insignia removed, as in Crimea and Belarus, and probably never leaving. In other words, today, Belarus is basically occupied by the Russian army. Let's be very clear about this. For years, Putin had wanted to build a military base in Belarus. Lukashenko said, but no, and so on, because Lukashenko knows that he's just one of Putin's satraps, and that he can jump if need be, if he's annexed. But then, in fact, if you like, formally, not formally, but de facto, Lukashenko is a Putin satrap. Formally, but de facto, Belarus has been annexed by Russia since at the end of August. In particular, the 15th and 16th of August, which I remember very well, as it's the date of my son's birth and the current date on my phone. So this is very important. Why the annexation of Belarus? Because You have to understand that Ukraine is very important economically for Russia. Historically, under the USSR, but that was a long time ago, about a century ago, it was described as Russia's industrial lung. Things have changed a little since then as the rest of Russia has industrialized. But it's still very important. In particular, they have a military-industrial complex that remains among the best in the world in terms of technology. They know how to make a lot of things. They have the manpower, they have the infrastructure, they have the equipment, the assembly lines, and the loss of Ukraine has caused a lot of delays in many Russian military programs. So you have to realize that Putin has a strategic interest in this, not just prestige. It was in his interest to keep Ukraine in the Russian fold, and there's a very real strategic risk for Russia in losing it. So this interest existed and still exists. It hasn't disappeared in 6 years. And the other thing that's important is that when there was the unrest in Ukraine, you'll remember that Vladimir Putin rallied. There was talk of it. There was fear of a Russian invasion of Ukraine, which in fact took place, but in small doses. There were small intervention groups. It was still hybrid warfare under Fostruk in the Donbass and the Republic of Lvov, which enabled them to resist the regular Ukrainian army, otherwise they would have fallen. But what we feared at the time was that the Russian army would invade the whole of Ukraine. Well, Putin didn't do it, so everyone thought it was too big a chunk for Russia and so on. Well, probably not. If Russia had gone, it might have done some damage. But even so, it would have been very difficult for Russia. Because if you look at the map at the time, forget everything in red. Russia was only deployed on its own border, i.e. South of Voronezh and around Rostov-on-Don. In other words, basically on one front. In such cases, even if you're a powerful army, if the others are determined, you risk a lot militarily. There's a major military hazard, and it's dangerous. So you're likely to suffer casualties. It's likely to put you in a difficult situation. Even if you're the strongest, you're always afraid of these things, as military history shows. Afghanistan, Vietnam, etc. Right? So Vladimir Putin has backed down. You've heard people say since then that he's content to have his hand vaguely on this sort of separatist Republic of Donbass, and that he's got Crimea, so he's keeping the port of Sevastopol, so he'll never go any further. But there's still something, despite everything, that changes the situation. Between the troops they still have in Transnistria, that bit you see between Moldavia and Ukraine, between the deployment of the link with Crimea, you know that a very large bridge has been built between the Russian territories and Crimea to the west of Krasnodar, which allows for the road and rail transport of equipment, and you have the Russians who have accumulated a lot of equipment that they didn't have before in 2014 in Crimea. Today there are lots of tanks, airplanes and so on, anti-aircraft guns they didn't have before, at least not in this quantity. And in the same way, if Russian troops invade Belarus, then you understand that Ukraine's situation has totally changed. Ukraine is now militarily indefensible should Russia decide to attack. This doesn't mean that Russia will invade immediately, but the threat is already different. From the moment you can be on just one front, when you can attack from all sides, it becomes different. And that's where you have to try and draw the parallel again and again. What could it be? If you take a look, could you please show me the next card, Guillaume? I've drawn a parallel with everything. I'd written a long article on this very subject towards the invasion of Ukraine at the beginning of the year 19. And in fact, I say that Ukraine is the equivalent of Czechoslovakia, or at least of the Czech Republic. But rather the whole of Czechoslovakia. Why is that? That's important. And it's something I didn't realize at the outset. I came back to it after thinking about it for a while. Well, in both cases, you see the Anschluss, that is to say the annexation of what is really closest to the territory, and which we can't do without because the cultural proximity is so close. Clearly nothing can be more a part of the Russian world than Belarus. In the same way, nothing could be more a part of the German world than Austria at the time. And in both cases, it's an annexation that allows you to encircle this other state, which poses a problem because it creates a strategic hole inside your territory. See, this forces you to make detours when you want to defend something, so it's already a disadvantage. But this territory also has a very important advantage. Czechoslovakia, I'll give you the figures again. Czechoslovakia had an extremely important steel industry. It was also a traditionally wealthy region since the capital is Prague, so for a very long time it had been a manufacturing area. And it's worth remembering that among the tanks used to invade Poland, then to beat France and England on the Western Front, the best and heaviest German tanks were the 38-ton Panzerkampfwagen. Except that, in fact, it was a German name that had been given to them, but they were Skoda tanks. They were Czech tanks that had been seized by German troops. When they invaded Czechoslovakia, the Germans seized 600 tanks and 1,000 aircraft. Enormous. And Hitler estimated that the equipment he had seized in Czechoslovakia had been enough to arm 45 German divisions. So it's considerable. It played a considerable role in the invasion of France in the same way as all the stocks that were seized in France played a role in the continuation and maintenance of the war, because historians today know that the French army was the only one to have been able to arm the Germans. In terms of war industry preparation, at the start of the war, contrary to popular belief, Germany wasn't at all. These tanks were really rubbish compared to the French ones. Well, it's really the use that was very talented, because in terms of equipment, it wasn't the equipment that Germany had at the end of the war, and that was really developed during the war. Germany's industrial effort came very late. It was around 2005-03 that industrial production really took off militarily. Before that, things were different, and between 2005-39 and 2005-45, Czech factories delivered 6,600 blended fighting machines to Germany. So really the industrial potential was there. So the interest in seizing Czechoslovakia was of the same order as that in recovering at least Eastern Europe for Russia. At least the eastern Ukraine. On the other hand, of course, what you want to say to yourself, it's true that it's the instinct we have, is that we say to ourselves, yes, but Czechoslovakia was very small, whereas the Ukraine is still a big chunk with a population of 45 million. Yes, but once again, you have to think in relation, because if you look at Germany at the time, Germany had a population of 70 million inhabitants. Czechoslovakia had a population of 15 million. So 15 million, that's a quarter of the population. If you multiply by 4, that's 60 million. So yes, it's a small quarter, a fifth, a small quarter. If you take the population of Russia today, 147 million, and compare it with the 45 million inhabitants of the Ukraine, 45 is a big quarter, because that would make 160 million if you multiply by 4. But in terms of order of magnitude, despite everything, we're not very far off. We're still on a fairly comparable scale. So it's not absurd, not least because we wouldn't be invading the whole of Ukraine. So, last comments. I also drew a parallel with France, because that's what happened in France too. First it annexed the republics. It began by annexing what was most French, i.e. the left bank of the Rhine. Then it expanded a little into Italy. And since it had a big strategic hole, and a rich one at that, the Piedmont you see in yellow, it really was one of the richest regions in Europe. France annexed Piedmont in 2, and then also invaded Switzerland. And it was the invasion of Switzerland and the annexation of Switzerland in particular that prompted the British to decide that war had to be declared on France-Napoleon again, because in peacetime, to give in to serial annexations was impossible, and France was becoming too big and too important. It was for the same reason that we declared war on Germany when it invaded Poland. And as you can see, these previous annexations were all about filling a strategic gap. You annex Austria, you've got a hole, you surround Czechoslovakia. Hop, you swallow Czechoslovakia. Once you've swallowed Czechoslovakia, you can encircle Poland, and then you swallow Poland. If you look today, if we make a projection, if we invaded at least the eastern half of Ukraine and annexed Belarus, you know what's left as a big hole? Well, there's still the Baltic States, squeezed between the Kaliningrad enclave, Belarus, and so on. So, next map please, Guillaume. Yes. Before moving on to the next map, we have a question. It's about cooperation between Turkey and Ukraine on drones. Can they be a game changer in the war between Ukraine and Russia? And can they worsen relations between the Turks and the Russians? Well, relations between the Turks and the Russians are already very bad, even though they're allies. As I've already said a little, I think this is an opportunity to say it again. The relationship between Turkey and Russia today is the same as that between the Soviets and the Nazis. In other words, there was the German-Soviet Pact, and today we have a Russian-Turkish Pact. In other words, they are in conflict on just about every front. In Syria, in Libya, in the Caucasus, since Azerbaijan recently took over an Armenian territory that was formerly the property of Azerbaijan. So on just about every front they are enemies, but nonetheless they are in a kind of alliance of hostility against Westerners, particularly Europeans. But Erdogan won't go against Putin in Ukraine, especially if he can negotiate Putin to leave him alone somewhere else. For example, when it comes to defending Greece, Putin has lowered his voice. Recently, when there were major tensions between Greece and Turkey, it was France which defended Greece, which sent in airstrikes, and Putin who said nothing. He didn't say to Erdogan, "Stop it, there are Orthodox brothers," etc. Nothing. Nothing. It was all very limp. And even in Armenia, Putin did nothing, because these are strategic interests of the highest priority for Erdogan and of secondary importance to Putin. On the other hand, in the Ukraine, we'd be in the opposite situation, so I think it's Erdogan who'd let things happen. So you have three possible scenarios for an invasion of Ukrainian territory, from the most tenable to the least tenable. The maximum estimate would be this blue line, which would only push back the border to the point where it would simply leave a piece of Ukraine. The interest or the logic of this advance in the context of a Russian invasion would be to have a relatively straight border that would include Belarus, Transnistria, and then Crimea. Then it would be a relatively clean border, easier to defend. But why complicated? Because you have to get past Kiev. You have to be able to seize them already, because these are areas where the Ukrainian population is hostile, since it's the most European population. And not only will the population be hostile, but it's also what would most shock the international order. On the other hand, the further east you go, and the more places where the population is very Russian-speaking and pro-Russian, the more tenable it is for Russia. Because the whole east, the line between Kharkiv, Dnipropetrovsk and Crimea, is what we used to call the New Russia. In fact, they tried to revive the concept of Novorossiya when the Ukrainian affair arose, because it's an area that was very heavily colonized by the Russians at the time of Catherine the Great, and when Russia seized Crimea from the Turks. So another possibility, a compromise, is to have a border that passes in front of Kiev, which would avoid the hassle of taking the Ukrainian capital and would make things more acceptable to the international community by not taking Kiev while still having a relatively straight border. And the last possibility, minimalist but the safest, would be to only take what are both strategic and industrial centers, and where the population is most pro-Russian, i.e. the third line, which would be the red line. There are three possible options in the event of a Russian invasion of Ukraine. So there's one thing to watch out for in the coming months, and that's whether there are any renewed tensions between Ukraine and Russia, because, you know, at the beginning with Zelensky, there was a blur. We wondered what the relations would be. And now, in fact, in the last few days, I've seen 3 pro-Russian channels censored in Ukraine. So it seems that there's a little tension coming back into play. And probably, in addition, Ukraine is worried about what's happening in Belarus. So that would be the first move. So at the same time, after what's happening on the other front with China and India, the first thing that's going to happen in Europe would be something around the Ukraine. After, of course, the annexation of Belarus, but that, as I said, has already happened. Cartier 1, please. Please. You've had one, that's it. So that's the situation in the Baltic States, now that Belarus is a vassal of Russia. You have the Kaliningrad enclave, where I showed you the Iskander missiles, which are nuclear-capable missiles, but not the only ones, and whose use is particularly recommended for bombing troop concentrations, a bombing which remains conventional. And so you have the axes that make the... so you see the Baltic states likewise find themselves in a situation where they are truly surrounded. Kaliningrad is full of troops. There are lots of... First of all, to defend it, because it's always scary when you have a little enclave like that on the outside. And the passage there next to the R of Iskander that you see between Kaliningrad and Belarus is called the Suwalki Corridor, meaning that there's a road that runs between Warsaw and Vilnius, which is the only area through which NATO troops could pass to defend the Baltic country without entering Russian or Belarusian territory, which would also be considered an affront by there too. So while the whole Belarusian affair was going on, it's important to remember that because it's something that's on the rise and could also justify interventions in the Baltic states. Lukashenko, it wasn't Putin who said it, but he had Lukashenko say it, had people in the Baltic states and Poland explain that they were trying to overthrow him and that they probably wanted to take the town of Rodno. Now, Rodno is basically the city and region south of Vilnius, i.e. the west-northwest corner of Belarus, which was historically Polish at one point. So you have this idea that there's a Polish threat on Belarusian territory, and that there's a threat too, so a kind of Polono-Balt alliance against Belarus. At that point, it could also serve as a pretext for invading them. And the blue arrows are the main routes for OTA reinforcements to the Baltic states. Because what you need to know is that you had reports from the RAND Corporation, I think in 2015 or something like that, which explained that basically given the war scenarios we've been able to do, the Kriegsspiele, the war games for what we do to try to, the simulations to see what could happen, the Baltic states, basically in a week and a fortnight, Russia could invade them. The problem is the Baltic states are part of NATO. They are formally under NATO's nuclear umbrella, the American nuclear umbrella in particular. And there you typically have the case studied by what I explained to you at the beginning. That is to say, when you can win a war against a fast-moving nuclear power. So we're no longer in the position of invading Western Europe, but for Russia, invading the Baltic states is possible if the objective is achieved very quickly, within a week or two, with massive cyber attacks and so on. You destroy everything. The Russians, I didn't tell you this before about the Ukraine, but there was a very interesting article I read in The Wire a few years ago. I think it must have been in the middle of the 80s, where you have massive, very regular cyber attacks on the Ukraine, and you've got whole cities going without power for 10 hours because of Russian cyber attacks. So basically, if they want to cut off power everywhere, it's likely that Russian cyber attack regiments are capable of doing that. So from there, you can invade a country like that any way you want. So you can make a limited rapid attack and present your adversary with a fait accompli, and if in a week, 2 weeks, the Russians have invaded the Baltic states and taken it over, what do you do afterwards? And they say, okay, now we'll stop, but on the other hand, we'll make the territory safe, we'll annex it, and if you attack us, there's a risk of nuclear war. What will the Western states do, knowing that this must be remembered if NATO's Article 5 is to be invoked? Article 5 refers to the solidarity of NATO countries in the event of aggression against one of them. Now you should know that in 2001, if I remember correctly, in 2001, when the United States suffered the 2001 attacks in September, it took, I think, 15 days, so we'll have to check, but it was something like that. 10-15 days for NATO to make a declaration that the United States was under attack, and that Article 5 therefore applied, that it was a war against the whole of NATO, which then justified everyone's participation in Afghanistan. This meant that by the time everyone agreed, Russia had finished invading the Baltic states. The problem is that if Russia invades the Baltic states, and that's one of the strategic interests of doing so, and then presenting everyone with a fait accompli, so there's no time for Article 5, and if, at the end of the day, we say, okay, Article 5, they've been attacked, they've been invaded, etc., but we're not going to risk a nuclear war like that now anyway. They've invaded them, they've got them, plus it's complicated because to go and take back the Baltic states now that the Russians have moved in, strategically it's a nightmare. It's likely to be dangerous, risk of nuclear war, risk of very heavy losses anyway. We'll let it go. If the Americans did that and agreed to let it go, it would mean that the credibility of their umbrella over NATO would be completely wiped out. And so the very credibility of the NATO system would be wiped out. So NATO would in fact break up, and that's Russia's ultimate strategic interest. Let me remind you that Putin's long-term strategic interest is to drive America into the sea, to establish his hegemony over Europe, so that Russia has a demographic and economic power base equivalent to that of China alone, and that of the United States alone, and thus to be in a true multipolar world, i.e. to have its own air of domination, and to be truly sovereign, because at present it is not at the economic and demographic level of the great powers that are the United States and China. So in fact, the first step is to succeed in destroying NATO. As long as NATO exists, Russia cannot impose itself, whereas if NATO disappears, it can individually, state by state. Russia is richer than most other states, even if not necessarily per capita, and it has superior military power. And then there are those with whom it has schemed, notably in Germany it has connections with gas, etc. Enormous means of pressure which could enable it to do without necessarily invading. It's not a question of occupying the whole of Europe, but the United States isn't occupying Europe at the moment. Practically all the American soldiers have left, but to establish a hegemony simply like that over Europe. And to achieve this, we need to break NATO. That's why, even if some people say there's no point in invading the Baltic States, if that's what it's for. Let me explain. As I said at the start, what triggers major conflicts is the fact that we launch ourselves into something thinking it's going to stop there. It's the same mistake Hitler made when he invaded Poland, the same mistake Napoleon made when he reclaimed Switzerland. Every time it's the same thing. Behind the scenes, the other side, who was used to negotiating, to saying we're not going to go to war over this, we're not going to go to war over that, suddenly says it's over. You stop, we're going to war. France and England after the invasion of Poland. And then, let's say, Russia invades the Baltic States, and the United States is unlikely to let that happen, because it would be far too dangerous to let it break out, let's say, afterwards. That means NATO falls apart and finds itself alone against China, for example, Japan, South Korea. We need to negotiate with China because the United States isn't going to come to our defense. And if we end up like the Baltic States, it's probably not worth it. So it would be a strategic nightmare for the Americans, which is why they're unlikely to give up. So what would be the reaction? Presumably, and here we're back to our, what I said earlier, the nuclear weapons of Hitler and Daladier. What would that be like? First reactions, at the very least, we're massing troops in Poland in front of the Suwałki corridor to show our determination. How's that going? Well, we know exactly what would happen, because France's Operation Anaconda was an exercise conducted to train for this and to demonstrate our determination, and to show how we're capable of doing this with NATO's Rapid Reaction Force. That is, the landing of NATO Airborne Forces number 1, 2, securing the bridges over the Vistula, and 3, the progression of Allied forces towards Lithuania to position themselves opposite the Suwałki corridor. That's NATO's first reaction, as we know, and that's what's planned. Any plan? I'm not lying. So I'm not making this up. It's this Operation Anaconda. It was carried out in 2016. So if the exercise was done like that, it's likely that we do it like that. And in any case, we don't see what other business there would be given the geostrategic configuration. So let's see the next projection, starting from there. Just before we received a donation from Marguerite Mullard. Thank you so much. And so a quick reminder, on previous occasions, what happened? It always happened in 3 stages. In the first stage, the vindictive imperialist takes over the, shall we say, augmented national space, i.e. the French world, the German world, and then the Russian world. So in the map, I hadn't planned to mention Ukraine because I'd concentrated on re-establishing the confrontation with NATO, but here you can add, count in red, that half of Ukraine was invaded by Russia at that time, so you have in one this strategic advance which produces anger and the desire of those, or at least the feeling of the need to finally confront the expansionism of the Allied powers, which prepares them to strike back. The vindictive imperialist is in a war of rapid movement, intervening immediately, bypassing the enemy forces, crushing them, and then moving on to a capital, a strategic point, toppling one of the allies and scoring the big initial success that means the war is about to start, and the war is going to be a long one, because he finds himself in a position of tenfold strength. Austria was defeated, and then we defeated the Austrians in Austerlitz one last time as the Russians had arrived, but that was the movement. For Germany, this meant the capture of Poland, the remilitarization of the Rhineland, and so on. The French and British massed. It was the phony war. They penetrated Belgium, bypassed, surrounded Dunkirk, crushed the French forces. Then the road to Paris was opened, Paris was taken, France fell, and that's when the war became long. So what would happen at home? What would it mean? Well, it would probably be a conventional war, albeit a limited one, as I said at the beginning, which would be either a non-strategic territory, as I explained earlier. It's the case of Belgium. If we look back with nuclear weapons to 2940, it could also be the case of this Polish border around the Suwalki corridor. I think it's still relevant. And then you'd have a limited conventional conflict in Poland with an encirclement of... I'm talking a bit too loudly. Is there something wrong with my microphone here? Because I can see that the line is all red. No, it's encirclement in Poland, followed by the rout of NATO forces, and the rest, well, we'll see, would probably be the imposition of at least an influence on, until the end of the war. At least an influence on up to Berlin, up to Germany, and we'll see why. So first thesis, how it would work, the Polish bypass. This is a quick diagram I drew up imagining what deployment would look like just after an invasion of the Netherlands in the context of a confrontation between NATO forces. So you'd have NATO, so in red are all the main roads in the region, the freeways or big national roads. These are the main troop transport routes. As usual, we don't take the back roads when we're moving tanks. So, according to Operation Anaconda, here's how the NATO forces would be deployed. They'd be positioned opposite the Suwalki corridor. You'd have the Russian forces in front of them, and you'd have to imagine a bypass that would be very surprising. I had imagined a Russian bypass that would surprise everyone and block the NATO forces, encircling them via Gdansk and Warsaw, so that Russia could advance at least as far as Warsaw. The second possibility is that NATO forces decide to advance on Vilnius and are intercepted on the Suwalki corridor and pushed back. At that point, the failure of the NATO forces would put NATO in a very perilous situation, because it would mean that, conventionally speaking, NATO would have no choice but to attack Vilnius. Because it would mean that conventionally there's no immediate way out, that we've also suffered a difficult defeat, and that we have no desire to enter into a nuclear war. So it would be a real triumph, even if it were limited. Even if you only have 20,000 NATO guys, for example, surrounded, caught, if that's all we can muster, because today we don't deploy the masses of men we used to. We've moved on to fourth-generation warfare. Today, however, losing 20,000 men is practically as serious as losing 200,000 or 500,000 50 years ago. From a political point of view, it would be such a shock we're not used to it anymore. It's already a catastrophe when we lose 10 men in Mali, so imagine 10,000 guys being taken prisoner by the Russians, for example, having lost their equipment. It's a catastrophe, alright? So I think that's the kind of hot war, at least limited. That's still very possible. So how far would the advance be at that point? It could be either a military advance, military, with troops advancing all the way, or military political, with countries taking Russia's side and agreeing to let Russian troops slice through their soil. So what would it be like? Can you give me the next case? There you have it. Maximum displacement at its peak, rather the era of maximum control at its peak of the next two revenge imperialists and the projection for the current one. Counting not only the countries that were defeated and occupied, but also taking into account the allies and vassals who chose to align themselves with the victorious side and swear loyalty. Do not worry, leave her be as she is. I believe it is still legible, it's just large red cups. However, what is fascinating and what you need to understand is that as the vengeful imperialist advances towards the east, his era of domination is also moving east, so that's why you have Spain in Napoleon's time, and then we go all the way to the Baltic States and the Black Sea. Then with Hitler, you go up to the Pyrenees, then on to the Caucasus and so on. So in all likelihood it would go even further, and still going up in the same order of magnitude, we'd move towards at least the French border on the Rhine and probably beyond. So at a conference I gave, I was told basically what would it be? Would Russia stop at the French border like the Chernobyl cloud? I explained that, on the one hand, it was because of this eastward shift that I assumed this, and on the other hand, it was because France is protected on its territory by a nuclear weapon, so even if Russia managed to advance that far somehow, it would stop at our border, even if we were, for example, a neutral country because we were afraid of getting into an open conflict with Russia. Then perhaps it wouldn't go as far as Italy, for example, and would be limited to part of Germany without going into the Netherlands. That's a possibility. But let's say that here, the displacement plus the non-nuclearized countries, it seems logical to arrive at something like that. especially since it aligns with another projection I'll present now, Guillaume, called the report. This is another type of projection I've made, which I think is equally informative. This is if you take the total space, again including the Allies, occupied at the maximum during the first of the two wars, during the War of Position. In terms of space occupied, there is a significant contrast between the 7 Years' War and Napoleon's empire. The first case, represented by dark red, depicts the territory of France and its Austrian ally during the war. On the other hand, scarlet red represents the peak of Napoleon's empire. This can be compared to the German and Austro-Hungarian empires, along with the territories they controlled, particularly in northern France. The size difference between the two is evident in the middle, where the largest portion, akin to a big pie, lies. It is important to note that this factual information remains unchanged. During the First World War versus, and here Scandinavia would actually be in red, well, especially Norway, the whole area occupied by Axis forces. So you can see that here too it goes in the same direction as the first maps, i.e. a much larger space. So if you compare it with the equivalence and power of the Soviet Empire at its peak during the Cold War, so counting Afghanistan and the entire Warsaw Pact, it means we'd have to go at least beyond that. So I've included Iran because today it's clearly one of Russia's allies. The region stretching from Iraq to Syria is commonly referred to as the Crescent, mainly because Syria is under the influence and control of Russia as a vassal state. Why? Because every other time, quite simply, Rovancha's realistic empire has gone further than the domination of the order it preceded in the previous war, and that's it. So that's why I think that after this initial success there would be a breakup of NATO, or at least a partial breakup of NATO, with renegotiations like that. Especially as it also makes sense with, can you display the Greek occurrences for me please? And here I'd like to refer you to all the shows I've done before. Let me remind you of the program I did on the dissolution of the European Union, in which I drew a parallel with the Hakian League, the Hakian invasion, between the Macedonians and the Romans, and so on. At the top, you have the Macedonian Empire at the time of Philip V. Then you have, after its defeat by the Romans, what I showed you earlier, the loss of its control over Greece, which corresponds to the loss of control over Europe, or at least over the part of Europe controlled by the USSR, so loss in Warsaw Pact. And then you have the final outcome, which is how the whole of Macedonia remained a Roman province and the Greeks remained relatively free cities. This gives me the opportunity to talk to you again about the Hakian League. When King Perseus of Macedonia re-entered the war against the Romans in 72 BC, the Third Macedonian War took place in 7278. The Hakian League was very passive and ultimately left the Romans to fight the Macedonians on their own, which the Romans took very badly. I refer you to the program I did. And then took their revenge on the Hakians a dozen years later, 20 years later, in 146. The Hakian League had been dissolved. So the big question is, if NATO were to break away in this way, it's possible that a large number of European Union countries would be fairly Atlanticist, or even adopt a position of neutrality between Russia and the United States, which would put the United States in a difficult position when it comes to troop transports and countering the Russian advance. And then, in all likelihood, in the years following the confrontation, it would complicate relations between the European Union and the United States, and I'll probably come back to this in the consequences, but I've already talked about it in the program on the dissolution of the European Union. So there you go, possibly a breakthrough and already a significant case with considerable progress. Last chance, the Carthage case. If you can show me, Guillaume. So Carthage went even further, the Roman imperialism of Charles de Carthage, because Carthage had managed to invade Roman territory and caused a pretty impressive death toll. Roughly 10% of the male population of Italy died in the great battles against Hannibal, 90,000 dead or thereabouts, and it's estimated that, compared to the American population today, that would be 15 million dead. So that would be possible in the context of even a limited nuclear war, so I can't rule out, maybe there'll be a war of movement with nuclear war, which I seemed to rule out earlier, but it's not impossible, that there could be real nuclear strikes. We're not immune. It's not the hypothesis I'm prioritizing, but there's something like that. It could also correspond to, say, attempts to land in Alaska if you're talking about Detroit Bering, that kind of projection, but it's a really maximalist hypothesis that seems unlikely to me in the current circumstances, and given the current world order, I'm just pointing it out to show that the maximalist hypothesis can still go very far, but well, I'm on a more median hypothesis that's still important, because if for a few years you have a relative Russian geomania that establishes itself over half of Europe, that's still not nothing.